now. Let's see, I think that those are the housekeeping items. I'll paste some of this information in the chat box for your reference as well. And if you have any technical questions, you can send them to me via the chat box as well, and I'll try to help you out. Okay, so now I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for today, who we're really lucky to have join us, another one of Point Blue's own, Dr. Erin Conlisk. Dr. Conlisk is a quantitative ecologist with the Pacific Coast and Central Valley group at Point Blue, and much of her work focuses on integrating field experiments with novel quantitative techniques to increase our understanding of how plants and wildlife respond to things like climate change and land use change and changing wildfire regimes. Dr. Conlisk received her doctorate from UC Berkeley's Multidisciplinary Energy and Resources Group, and today she'll be talking with us about her work on fire ecology and conservation in Southern California's shrublands. So Dr. Conlisk, thanks so much for joining us today. We're really glad for the opportunity to hear about your work, and please take it away.
Thank you so much for that intro. Everyone can hear me? A thumbs up?
Yes.
So I'm excited to talk about conservation in Southern California shrublands. And I'm just gonna say that this is a little bit, I'm gonna start with sort of a long background because I'm gonna diverge somewhat from Sasha and Jay's talks of last week and the week before, in that in Southern California and the regions where I work, we're really talking about stand replacing wildfire, and we're not talking about there being a paucity or a lack of wildfire. There's really quite a bit, and it's happening at frequencies that are higher than some of these ecosystems can maintain. Okay, why are my slides not advancing now? There we go. So this is work that I did. I've always had great collaborators. I have great collaborators at Point Blue. This is work that I've largely did prior to coming to Point Blue. And so I just want to acknowledge the support of these great folks. So Sasha 2 weeks ago showed a table with similar information as what I'm showing here. And what I have on the y-axis is years. And this is an estimate of the pre-European fire return interval. So roughly the number of years between fires. And thus far, we focused on ecosystems like mixed conifers and oak woodlands that have relatively shorter fire return intervals compared to the chaparral that I'm going to talk about today. So chaparral is this one here with roughly a 50-year fire return interval, but the width of the bar is the fact that that varies across the landscape. Now, fire regimes are not just fire frequencies, as I'm showing here. Right? They're also intensity or severity. Those aren't synonymous, but they're often correlated. And so when you think about shrublands in Southern California, think of this stand replacing fire here in the upper left. I'm showing pictures from subalpine forest, which you can see is one of the really high fire return intervals. But you can contrast stand replacing fire to crown fire, right? So the fire makes it into the canopy, but doesn't fully leave scorched earth, no individual left standing, and then surface fires, which are typically fast moving fires that don't make it to the canopy. Along with frequency and intensity or severity, we've got size and pattern. And Jay really spoke to this well last week, talking about the mosaics and how these large mega fires often lead larger swaths of really intense and severe fire. And then seasonality. And so I remember these as fists, but yeah, if that's not helpful for you, come up with your own acronym. So when we're talking about seasonality, we can't help but acknowledge how humans are changing the firescape. So here I'm showing a map on the left, which is the proportion of the fires, where the bigger the circle, the more the fires. The proportion of fires in red, those are largely human-caused fires. And as we shift to blue, those are largely lightning-ignited fires. And you can see in this figure on the right that there's a lot of human-ignited fires throughout the year. And if we look at the natural regime, those lightning-ignited fires, they're typically right there during the summer. So humans are changing when fires occur. So they're changing the seasonality. Now, again, zooming in on California, we see that this relationship of what causes the fire is very similar to how it has changed, how fire has changed over the past 120 years. And so what I'm showing here is the percent departure from the historic fire return interval. So any of the blue colors you see in Northern California are regions where there are more years between fires, you know, up to a doubling in the historic fire return interval. And in Southern California, we see yellow colors, or warmer colors, which mean that the fire return interval has shortened. So we're having too frequent fire. And in chaparral ecosystems where stand replacing fire is the norm, we're really mostly talking about, when we talk about the threat of wildfire to these ecosystems, we're really talking about too frequent fire. And then if you also can zoom in on what, on how the ignitions start, you see that in Mediterranean California, very different pattern of ignitions than in the temperate Sierras. So I'm just going to focus now a little more background on Southern California shrubland fire with a few more brief comparisons to forests. So here, I think this picture is very evocative of the problem. So this entire area burned in 1970. In the background, we see a landscape that then matured over the intervening 40 years after this picture was taken. In the midground, we see another fire in 2001. And in the foreground, we see the 1975, a region that had a fire in 1970 and then one in 2001 and 2003. And you can see that those back-to-back fires really made recovery more challenging for this landscape. And this is one picture, and you may say, well, how representative? Well, this vegetation type conversion can really happen across many. Here's another evocative picture taken in the Santa Monica Mountains. The last picture was in San Diego. So this is a real concern across Southern California. And if you actually look across, you know, about 2,000 plots that share the characteristics of being, you know, short fire return intervals, close to human infrastructure, we see that about 800 of these plots have seen a loss in woody shrub cover, compared to about 100 that have seen a gain in woody shrub cover, and then about 1,800 that are unchanged. So really, if we're talking about fire in Southern California, we're talking about the loss of woody shrubs due to frequent fire. So what's the impact of climate change, right? It's getting hotter and it's getting drier, so that should lead to more fire in Southern California. Well, maybe. So what I'm showing here is I'm showing the number of acres burned on the y-axis versus the vapor pressure deficit on the x-axis. And as you move left to right, you're moving to hotter and drier conditions. And you can see that there's a weak relationship with the millions of acres burned. And you might say, well, you know, that doesn't look so weak. Well, compare that to forested ecosystems, right? Really strong relationship. As we get, as the climate becomes more arid, we see a really strong relationship with the amount of acreage burned. And so in this conceptual diagram, you know, we need to think about, so as we increase aridity, if we are in a landscape where there's ample moisture to grow fuel, AKA forests, that as you increase aridity, you're going to increase fire risk. But you get to a point where it's too arid, it's too dry, it's too hot, and now you're going to start to see the landscape becoming fuel limited. And so now we're moving to shrublands, maybe grasslands, and you're potentially walking down this fire risk. So I'm going to be focusing mainly on, you know, sort of landscapes on the right-hand side. But before I do, I'm going to say one more thing about forests, which is across much of the Western US, we see that after fire, there's recruitment failure. Failure may be a strong word. How about declined recruitment? And so this is in the appendix of this paper by Davies and Veblen. And you can just see declining recruitment through the years as conditions got hotter and drier. And this is a little shameless, but I'm going to just talk about my own work in forests briefly to say that, you know, they attribute this declining recruitment to the impacts of climate change. And this is also what I found working in subalpine forests, looking at experimental warming. So if you if you sow seeds and then you put warming manipulations over them, and you compared control heated, watered, and heated and watered, and this is lodgepole pine, but same roughly the same results with limber pine and Engelmann spruce. You see really reduced recruitment with any type of heating. And that's the same at treeline and alpine, even though these are, you know, sort of at the cold limit of these species. So take home, warming combined with fire could be pushing our forests into that more moisture limited, you know, with increased aridity, like locations where we see forests maybe declining post fire. All right, so just so that, you know, to just summarize our shared understanding up till now, in forests, right, we see that historic fire suppression has led to a lack of fire in Northern California landscapes. With the introduction of, with the increasing aridity we've observed over the past 20 and 40 years, we see roughly a 10-fold increase in these large stand replacing mega fires. And we expect climate change to continue to drive that pattern. Hopefully we'll come to a new equilibrium where, you know, fire suppression doesn't sort of create this tinderbox that we've been observing recently. Now, what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk is non-forested ecosystems where stand replacing fire is the norm. And so we're looking at longer historic fire return intervals, more fire on the landscape post-European colonization. And the real threat to these systems is loss of woody plants due to these frequent fires. And the relationship with climate change is unclear because we don't know how that's going to influence fuel loads. Okay, so in what remains, I want to talk about 4 projects that I've done looking at conservation in Southern California ecosystems. So the first project I want to talk about is looking at the relative vulnerability of chaparral plants. So Sasha 2 weeks ago talked about different plant functional types, right? So after a fire, plants can they have these strategies to be resilient to fire. They can be resistors. They can avoid the fire. I'm going to talk about 2 quintessential chaparral fire plant functional types, namely obligate cedars and resprouting plants. And I'm going to compare the relative vulnerability of climate change, land use change, and altered wildfire. Armed with that knowledge, I'm then going to look at management for rodents and birds with competing wildfire needs at Camp Pendleton. One of the birds that I looked at Camp Pendleton that I am going to delve deeper into is looking at the optimal site for restoration with heterogeneous fire risk across the landscape. I'm going to end looking at a very different question, which is looking at vulnerable human communities, because I think the nexus of vulnerable human communities and vulnerable biodiversity could potentially lead to, identification of co-benefits and how managing wildfire in the landscape could benefit both people and wildlife. All right, so resprouters. So these types, this plant functional type, these are plants that, or shrubs that really they invest in below ground resources. So they are currently found on wetter locations, north facing slopes, and they invest in these deep roots to get those underground water resources. And this strategy means that they want that if I'm anthropomizing plants, they want the individuals it's beneficial for individuals to survive fire and resprout after fire because they've invested so much in that below ground growth. And by investing in that below ground growth, for example, with lignose tubers, they have starches and moisture resources they can access to resprout directly following fire. Now, obligate cedars have a different strategy. So these are species that invest less in underground resources, typically occupy drier south-facing slopes. And their strategy is to not invest in survival through a fire, but to invest in the next generation. So basically they build up this long-lived seed bank so that when the canopy is burned off in a fire, the new generation can come up into this very sunlit environment for growth. And so if you imagine the life cycle of a ceanothus, an obligate seeding ceanothus, you can see that, right, as the individual grows, so does its seed bank. So if you have another fire before the seed bank develops, say, you know, when you've got sort of halfway across this timeline, there aren't enough seeds to really regenerate a robust population. And so if you have these frequent fires, you're not going to get the same populations of obligate seeders. And one fun thing you can do with plant ecologists in fire is to talk about whether this is an adaptation to fire or drought. Many people feel like these were originally drought adaptations that are actually exaptations to fire. So my question was, compared to climate change and land use change vulnerability, how vulnerable are these two plant groups to increased fire? Now, to answer that question, we had to come up with new models. So the typical way that people look at the influence of climate change, or a way people look at the influence of climate change, is to look at where species occur now with given climate variables, and then where they're going to occur in the future, given that relationship between the organism and its climate niche. So a really simple example, and for the rest of this section of the talk, I'm going to be talking about Engelmann oak. A really simple example of a species distribution model would be just looking at temperature. And you can see that the black points, which are locations where Engelmann oak are found, and this is Western San Diego County, are occurring in the green areas on the map, which represent temperatures between 30 and 36 degrees Celsius. Okay, so that's the simplest species distribution model, is the green areas on this map. And so if we look at the green areas in a future climate, we see that now they're occurring in the eastern portion of this region. So these are higher elevations in San Diego, and these black squiggly lines should have identification, but this is I-8, I-15, I-5 over here. And then there's also some locations of moderate temperature on the coast. But you can see a real reduction in the climate envelope of Engelmann oak. So anyways, you can project these relationships onto a map of the future, and you now have a future map of where the species will occur with climate change. You can also map, you can simulate land use change, and you can use that to mask out regions, combining climate change and threats due to climate change and threats due to land use change. But how do we add population dynamics, right? Because fire is influencing these population dynamics. And to do that, we take these maps that we've created, and we say any place where there's a pocket of suitable habitat, we're going to call that a population. And so you take your spatial map here, and you translate that into a metapopulation map. And each of these circles is a well-mixed population, and the lines between the circles are dispersal between populations. And so what happens within a population is we have all these vital rates. So we have survival rates that define going from a seed to a seedling, from a seedling to a sapling, from a sapling to an adult tree. And then, you know, some of these life stages will produce seeds. And so this is a conceptual diagram of a population model. So we parameterize this population model with Camp Pendleton data, which you may have seen on the last slide. You can also look at things such as disease, exotic invasions, and what we care about, which is fire. And so in a fire, you know, most of these vital rates are dialed way down, right? So there isn't going to be a whole lot of fecundity directly following fire. Instead, individuals that have been burned down to, you know, just those underground, you know, burned down to a trunk that's going to resprout from underground resources, this becomes the main vital rate here, which is, you know, represented with the changing widths of the arrows. All right, so what happens when we do this? So here what we want to do is we want to compare, I'm showing the expected minimum abundance. So this is the abundance of Engelmann oak across different fire return intervals. So if you have a short fire return interval, that means fewer years between fire and more fire. And I'm going to put that on the x-axis, and then I'm going to compare no land use change, no climate change, land use change, a hotter and wetter climate, and a hotter and drier climate. So in the no change scenario, you see this shallow slope where decreasing fire leads to a higher populations. If you add land use change, we see that land use change is not expected to influence Engelmann oak, so very little change. If you look at climate change, both the hotter and wetter climate and the hotter and drier climate, you see over a 90% reduction in Engelmann oak populations. Now let's so again, Engelmann oak is our example species for a resprouter. Now let's look at our obligate seeding species, right? Species that die in a fire and rely on their long-lived seed bank for the next generation. And so what you see here is a much steeper slope going from too frequent fire to sort of the historic, say 40-year fire return interval. You see almost a doubling in the population. And then across, and this doubling in population, right, going in the no change scenario is roughly on par with, reductions in the population going from no change to a hotter and wetter climate. So we see that our obligate seeders, as our intuition would suggest, are much more vulnerable to altered fire regimes. Now, I should say that this bottom half of the curve is a little bit speculative. And it just assumes that the obligate seeders don't produce as many seeds late in their life. And some people debate that. Okay, so take home, resprouters are more vulnerable to climate change, and obligate seeders are more vulnerable to altered wildfire. So we know that chaparral species, and in particular obligate seeding species, are vulnerable to wildfires. So the next question is, how can we manage for species with competing wildfire requirements? So we have some understanding of the influence to the vegetation. How do wildlife that depends on that vegetation, how are they also influenced in turn by changing wildfire? And the work that I'm about to talk about was done at Camp Pendleton. And I just show this picture so that we, to just acknowledge how Camp Pendleton is a really unusual and I appreciate the fact that it's one of the few undeveloped regions, going from Tijuana through Los Angeles on the coast of Southern California. And so because Camp Pendleton is this rare undeveloped area, it is home to some species that are otherwise uncommon on the landscape. So examples are the Steffen's kangaroo rat, the Pacific pocket mouse, both endangered and critically endangered, and then birds of special concern, the coastal cactus wren and the gnatcatcher. Now, so the rodents, well, actually, let's start with the birds. The birds, more fire is a concern for them because it reduces these stand replacing fires, reduce the shrub cover that they depend on, and in particular for the cactus wren, Opuntia glows. These cactus grow back very slowly, and the cactus wren relies on these as sites for its nests. And more fire can also change vegetation type. Increased fire can lead to this vegetation type conversion. So habitat quality, after a fire, it's much reduced, and then there's a slow recovery. So this is a conceptual diagram of habitat quality and time since fire for the birds. The rodents, on the other hand, are threatened by non-native vegetation that chokes out foraging habitat. And so what's often done to benefit these rodents is prescribe burns that clear out the understory. However, that creates this cycle where, then there's more likely to be vegetation type transition to non-native grasslands, and so more need for prescribed fire and management. So to look at these two groups of species with competing needs, we created this shrub succession model at Camp Pendleton. So basically we mapped fire on the landscape, which is represented here, and then we simulated fire. say those are 2 simulations in a given year of the model. Then we simulated the shrub response to that fire based on shrub transition rates going from data from 1933 and 2003. So we see that in areas of high fire on Camp Pendleton, which I've circled here, we see a big loss in chaparral. That's not surprising, but these data were then used to project into the future based on the transitions that were observed in the past. In areas of low fire, you can see some shrub recovery. Okay, so we simulate the vegetation landscape, and then we simulate the birds and the rodents and their dependency on the landscape. So for the birds, we assumed that the that the gnatcatcher could occupy habitat 8 years post-fire. We thought the shrubs would be decently robust to allow them to occupy a habitat 8 years after a fire, and cactus Wren 15, because again, Metapopulation grows slower. And the rodents, we had survival declining with time since fire as recovery of non-natives after fire accelerated. And then we had dispersal that was limited based on these birds and rodents dispersal abilities. So we considered 6 management options: the status quo, which means we just left the landscape according to the management that Pendleton was currently doing. It decreased burned area by 25%. We reduced fire near occupied bird habitat. So those are these green places on this map of Camp Pendleton. And the blue dots across here are the other blue dots. Those are cactus Wren and gnatcatchers. We lowered the probability of coastal sage stubs burning. We restored habitat, and that can take a variety of forms, right? And I'll talk about that a little in the next section. But basically the upshot was, by assuming restored habitat, cactus Wren would occupy habitat in half the time that they did under the status quo, and same with the gnatcatchers. And then for the rodents, we had their vital rates decreasing more slowly after fire. The rodents, if you can see, they're yellow and red on the landscape. There were prescribed burns specifically for their benefit. And so we also explored eliminating those prescribed burns. We employed a 50-year time horizon. And here's an example. So we ran the simulation 500 times, and here's an example of what we observed, which is dramatic loss, on the order of 60% loss in chaparral by 2050. We saw about a 20% increase in woodlands, but there aren't that many, so it's hard to see that with your eye. We saw coastal sage scrubs stayed mostly the same, and grasslands increased about 20% on the landscape. And so what that meant for the cactus Wren, I'm just going to show the most extreme outcomes, or most extreme management strategies. So for cactus Wren, the status quo meant that there were big reductions in the population. So what I'm showing here is the number of simulations in which we observed a particular fraction of the original population. So if it's 1, that means that the population at the end of the simulation was the same as the population at the beginning. And if it's shifted to the right, it means the population grew, and it shifted to the left, so numbers less than 1, that means the population was lower at the end of the simulation. And so the most likely outcome for cactus Wren was about an 80% reduction in the population under the status quo. If we reduce the area burnt, we see that the most likely outcome is more like a 40 to an 80% decrease in the population. So much better if we reduce area burnt, and even better if we target that to coastal sage. We see even better outcomes for the cactus Wren, and some non-trivial number of runs in which the population actually grew. Similar outcomes for the gnatcatcher. So overall, we saw large decreases in the population. The best strategy was to lower coastal sage scrub burning, and the worst strategy was the status quo. Now, these are big losses in population, but there was only one extirpation across all runs. So we do expect that these two species will survive at least the next 50 years or until 2050. The Pacific pocket mouse and Stephan kangaroo rat, I've added one more management option, which is stopping prescribed burns, because that was clearly the worst of the management options. That led, if you remove the prescribed burns, you saw a big reduction in the populations, and extirpation was overwhelmingly the most likely outcome. I should have mentioned this earlier, but these maps are where the individuals were simulated to be found on the landscape. Right, so extirpation was the most likely outcome. But you can see that there's high variability. So especially for the Stephan's kangaroo rat, there were a lot of runs in which the population more than doubled. And you can see that little blip here for the pocket mouse as well, but anything above 2 is more than doubling population. So really our understanding of these, the Pacific pocket mouse and the kangaroo rats vital rates or survival rates was really quite broad and potentially a target for future research. So now in this last slide on this part of the talk, I just want to compare all of these management options to the status quo. So here I've got the 5 restoration, management options and the 4 species. And then I'm showing each of the elements of the table are the percent change relative to the status quo. So anything yellow means that the status quo, there was very little change compared to the status quo. Warmer colors mean the reduction, bluer colors meant that the management strategy was beneficial. So what you see here is that protecting coastal sage and restoring habitat led to a option that did not harm either group of species for the benefit of the other group. So these were our 2 best management options at Camp Pendleton. And in part this was because that type of management created a mosaic in which both species could co-occur. Okay, so I'm going to delve. So the main take home of the second part of the talk is that restoration and protecting coastal sage scrub were adequate and were the best options for preserving 2 groups of species with conflicting wildfire needs. So what is the optimal restoration site given heterogeneous fire risk? So this project was done with the San Diego Zoo. And so there was this big fire in 2007, the combined witch-pumacha fire, and it basically melted a bunch of the cactus that the cactus wren depend on. So the San Diego Zoo motivated to start growing cactus for transplant in restoration activities. And my job was to figure out where in the San Pasqual Valley. So this is again in San Diego. It's this red area boxed in right here. Here's I-15. Where in San Pasqual Valley to do this restoration. And the blue areas are occupied cactus wren habitat. So the safari park is here. It's part of the zoo. And then, you can see the other patches across the landscape. And then there was potentially good habitat here, but no cactus wren there. And so sort of the conceptual idea here is that we have, when you're sort of thinking about reserve design, typically folks want to minimize fragmentation. So they think about this red column, the second column, as being the better reserve design option, bigger size, less separation and isolation, closer or more concentrated spatial arrangement. But if you're thinking about fire and you're thinking about risk spreading, you actually might prefer this first column, right? So separated populations, while they're potentially more isolated, you potentially have patches that escape a fire. If you're more isolated than if all your patches are together on the landscape. And so this was the sort of conceptual idea behind considering 3 main restoration strategies: corridors, augmenting existing habitat, and fire refuges. And so basically I took this landscape and mapped fire across the landscape, which is here. Now what I'm showing, I've taken away the Google image, and now I'm showing brown areas are years with more fire, so fewer years between fire. And then in sort of downtown Escondido, you can see little fire risk. So I extracted the average fire risk for each of these patches. So now the patches are colored by their fire return interval. And the blue areas are potential habitat. And this is public land where we could have done 20 hectares of restoration, which is what we had cactus. We had, I sometimes call this project 2 women against 2 tons of cactus, because we had about 2 tons of cactus that we needed to transplant across 20 hectares. So the first option was a stepping stone, 10 2-hectare patches through this corridor, or 2 10-hectare patches. We then consider augmenting habitat here in Lake Hodges with sort of a moderate fire return interval. And we considered creating a new patch here that was protected from fire, and creating a patch here in a robust population that, but this is sort of a straw man, because we could not, that wasn't actually public land, but it was also a fire refuge. Okay, and again, we use these metapopulation models that add these important biological processes, map growth and survival, allow for dispersal. And the results were that, you know, compared to no restoration, a 10-patch corridor was simply too fragmented. It provided very little benefit. And that really we wanted to concentrate the populations as they existed currently on the landscape. We wanted to just augment the existing habitat. And that the best option would have been that restoration in that isolated patch that had little fire, but existing robust populations. However, that was not possible. But that still, it was clear that there was this trade-off between fire refuge and you know, or rather there was a benefit of creating these fire refuges. However, creating a new patch from scratch was not as good as augmenting existing habitat. So ultimately we ended up augmenting this Lake Hodges patch down here in the southwest of the map. And we actually, because we had built this partnership to actually execute this restoration, we furthered it, and we didn't just restore cactus, we restored shrubs. So you can see that there still isn't a lot of regrowth after 7 years. And so we created these plots that had anywhere from one to 8 species in them, and asked whether more species and functional diversity led to lower exotic cover. And there's a weak relationship, but this was directly after planting. And so now 8 years later, it would be great to go back and resample. All right, so we found the optimal restoration site that balanced wildfire risk and fragmentation to augment existing habitat. And so now I'm going to ask a very different question, which is, are lower priced homes more likely to burn? And you may say, wait, what? We've been talking about conservation thus far. Why are you changing to this question? And I would just point to this figure, and it's a little messy, so but I want you to know where I'm getting the figures in the next slide, which is much of our, the landscape that harbors biodiversity is also at greater risk of fire. So what you see here is I'm overlaying fire count 1 to 12 in yellows to reds over native species count and native biodiversity rank. And so the deeper the blue, the higher the biodiversity value. And if you extract these across space and plot them, you see that higher biodiversity rank and species count correspond to areas with higher fire count. And this isn't causal. This is because the places that are left with high biodiversity are also the places that have high fire risk. And so when we think about fire risk, fire risk also influences human communities. And so that's why I was asking this question. And it also is interesting to note that if you think about, well, actually, I'm going to skip this. We can come back to that if you're interested. But right, so historically, we think about, we think about residential structures being at risk in the wildland-urban interface. And historically, the most at-risk fires, say 60% of destroyed structures, were occurring at very low housing densities, right? So these red bars on the far left. But most structures are in these areas of high density. And so starting in San Diego in 2003, and then again in 2007, what we started to see was fires that ripped through our natural landscapes and then spilled into our more denser residential developments. And we saw that later in 2017 and 2018 across the state. And so when we think about wildfire at the wildland-urban interface, a question you might have is, well, who lives in these developments? Are these folks that are escaping the urban center to get natural amenities? Or are these folks that cannot afford to live in the urban center? And so they're moving to these suburban locations and accepting higher wildfire risk. And so that was the sort of intuition behind our question. So what we did was we looked within all fire perimeters. We looked within the Zillow home sales data, right? So Zillow and this estimate that we can all look up online. We extracted just the price of homes that sold 3 years prior to a fire. Sorry, not 3, 6 years prior to a fire. So for example, this is a representative fire, the Grand Prix and Old fires. There were 62 burned structures for which we had Zillow price data, and there were 209 unburned structures for which we had Zillow home price data. And so if you just look at the home prices, you see that the burned structures are shifted to lower home price compared to the unburned structures. And so the next question is, well, wait, but could it possibly be that those structures that burned were actually in riskier locations and that lower priced homes are put in riskier locations? Well, when we created a model that corrected for that, and I'm now showing the model fit here in purple, we saw no. There was in fact a significant influence of home price, and that for any fire with greater than 50 burned structures in it, so those are the green fires on the landscape, lower priced homes were more likely to burn. So really there is an intersection. We have our natural spaces that harbor our biodiversity, but they also come with high wildfire risk, and those put neighborhoods with lower priced homes in greater danger. Okay, so just to conclude, we've talked about a lot of stuff, and I moved fast. We talked about how accidental ignitions, especially in Southern California, are leading to more fire in Southern California. We've talked about how suppression in forested system has led to less fire in forested regions, how non-natives are potentially causing vegetation type conversion with this increased fire, and how climate change certainly is going to have influences on our forested systems and yet to be determined influences in our shrublands. And there's feedbacks, again, between climate, vegetation, and wildfire. And so with this really complicated picture, I just want to highlight that there are also solutions that, I gave 4 projects in which we had, anywhere from a sort of, ecological question about which types of plants do best or which types of plants are more at risk due to wildfire compared to other competing global change pressures, to very applied questions looking at whether species with competing demands can coexist on a landscape. And what we found was that, what I believe Jay said and what I believe Sasha said, which is that returning to a wildfire regime that most closely matches the historic regime can remedy some of these coexistence conflicts and preserve those species that we've been accustomed to living with. And there may also be a benefit to human communities. And so with that, I conclude, and I'm happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erin. Really interesting and important work. So thank you so much for taking the time to share it with us. We have about 12 minutes for Q&A. So if folks haven't throughout been dropping questions in there and you have some, please go ahead and drop them in there now, and we can get started. So I have one here that can kick us off from Randy Hanvelt. And the question is referring to the very beginning of your talk and where you discussed non-urban and forested lands. And the question is, can you correlate the issue that you highlighted, and hopefully, can you correlate the issue that you highlighted with forest density and drier trees that are more susceptible to fire?
That is not my work. Fire suppression in dense forests are one of the main drivers of the current sort of large mega fires, right? So we're talking, so aridity is clearly an issue. Fire suppression is clearly an issue, and I think that's what you're speaking to. And then, the third one, which I think is much more prominent in Southern California, or a prominent driver in Southern California, but it's present in Northern California, is also ignitions, and how human ignitions are changing across the landscape. But it's much more prominent of a driver in Southern California. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I mean, I think you were referring to whether fire suppression has influenced the changes in the wildfire regime. And the answer is yes.
Great, thank you. I have another one from Randy, and this one I think this is an interesting one. So how do you choose the species that you focus on? As indicators and, sort of across your work, how do you think about that? And then, and if you could maybe speak to, what the populations of some of these species looked like, say, 100 years ago in relation to today.
That's a tough one. I mean, the main answer to yours is there is some interest in the species, be it because the species is rare, or because there has been a historic interest in the species. So then there's a robust data set that can be relied upon to create these types of understanding. So it's opportunistic in many regards, but again, within the species and every day, right, we're coalescing and we're aggregating our understanding. So when I built these population models about a decade ago, Comadre and Copadre didn't exist, but these are basically compendiums. Some folks in Europe had tried to coalesce all of our population models into one place. So even now, were I to start this project again, I could have a bigger suite of species to choose from. But still within that, we really wanted, especially with that first project, we wanted to highlight distinct differences that we think structure groups of species responses, right? So the obligate cedars versus the reese-routers, and the birds versus the rodents, or I don't need to make them competing, but you know what I'm saying, is that choosing these clear natural history representatives was our goal. Another project I've worked on, what we specifically did was look at birds primarily and mammals that had different habitat affiliations. So looking at connectivity throughout Southern California, we chose species that were representative of coastal sage and chaparral, and grasslands was really too difficult given the modifications to grasslands. But that's the goal, is some combination of what is available with what can represent a larger group, or what is at risk. So really we need a better understanding of. And most of what I focused on right now was were species that had some level of vulnerability.
Great, thank you for that answer. Okay, we have a question from Garrett Gradilis. With so many cards stacked against us here, climate change, number of human ignitions, increase of fire-prone exotic species, etc., how might we return to a normal fire return interval in Southern California?
Yeah, so I would say two things. I would say one, the more we understand about the changes, the more we can prepare for what they are, right? So understanding that obligate cedars are at greater risk, you know, we can think about when we have a restoration, think about specifically targeting these vulnerable species. So I guess what I'm saying is the broader idea is that we know things are changing, and the more we understand, the better we can sort of plan that change. The second thing I'd say, and this is something I really would like to explore, is the influence in Southern California of urban infill, right? So trying to put our development so that our residential development, so that we're not putting people in risky locations. We're not building homes in risky locations. And we're, you know, being very conscientious of both the trade-off of, or the co-benefits of building in conservation smart and wildfire smart locations. You know, that's what we can do.
Awesome, thank you, Erin. Okay, we have I have another question from Randy, and Randy was wondering if you have done an error analysis on your species population models, and this is referring, I believe, to the second project where you looked at bird and rodent species with conflicting wildfire needs.
Oh, that one. So to answer, I'm going to start by answering the first project. So we actually did do an error analysis. I didn't show it, but so we compared obligate cedars and respratters and some various other species. And one of those species we compared, because we had these models that had uncertainty in the climate change scenario, uncertainty in the types of algorithms you can use to project onto the landscape, uncertainty in the vital rates, all of these different uncertainties. We created a paper that was just looking at those uncertainties. And what we found was that the uncertainties in just the climate projections, right? So whether it was hotter or wetter or hotter or drier, was the overwhelming uncertainty. And so, yes, there were certainly uncertainties in the vital rates and the algorithms we use to project into climate, but that overwhelmingly the biggest uncertainty was the actual climate projections. Now, for the Camp Pendleton project, we did not explicitly explore changing how the changes in the vital rates would change the outcomes. The way we looked at uncertainty, right, was to run the model many, many times. And the many different times we ran the model, we came with different outcomes, and tweaking different management strategies, we came with different outcomes. So sort of implicit in the question was already in an uncertainty analysis. You know, some outcomes led to a decline in the population, the majority for the birds, but there were some outcomes where the population did grow. And so that right there is a type of uncertainty analysis, because it's showing the potential spread of outcomes.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for the great questions, and thank you for those answers, Erin.
Andy, so you can come to all my talks.
So we're approaching the top of the hour, and I think we were able to address most of the questions that were in the chat box. If anybody has anything lingering, feel free to put it in now. Otherwise, I think we'll I'll sort of tie it up there for us and just say thank you so much, Erin, again, for taking the time to share your expertise and your knowledge with the group. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that it was a real treat to hear from you today on all of that. So thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea, for organizing such a fun
it's my pleasure.
Seminar series.
It's my pleasure.
And thank you for all the great questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Some great questions there. And thanks for everyone, or to everyone, for joining again this week. I'll look forward to seeing everyone next week at the same place, same time. And we'll have Dr. John Mola from the USGS with us, who will be talking about the effects of wildfires on bumblebee populations across California's grassland and chaparral habitats. So look forward to that. And thank you, Erin. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And until next time, take care.